meeting up again, and welcome to the closing panel of the conference. And I'm very glad to be introducing Nadya Wells, who's the Senior Research Advisor on the FINPHARM project, who's comes from the investment world, financial investments especially. And from what I understand, the paper that she's presenting today has made a big splash recently. So I'm looking forward to, I think we're all looking forward to hearing more about it. Thank you, Nadya.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to present a paper where we've done what has been called now by two of the key opinion leaders in this space, a post-mortem on the demise of IHEID, a US-based small and medium-sized, I guess, SME biotech company which developed a new aminoglycoside called plazomicin. I am talking about the paper, which is up in the right-hand corner of the screen here, and I will present some context, which is just basically to scare you from the financial aspects. We've talked about many other aspects of the AMR problem today in the previous panels, but I'm going to be talking about the financial issues. I'm going to tell you a little bit about our methodology that we employed to do this paper, which is novel. And I'll talk, of course, about the case, but we have Ryan Kears here, who was at the IHEID, who will be giving our keynote afterwards. So I will stand corrected. I will cede to his, of course, superior knowledge of what was going on in those days in section 3 of this conversation. And then I'll talk about some of the implications that we have taken out of the study of this case study for the antibiotic investment ecosystem, which is in dire straits. So, the scary bits. So, I just send you these numbers because the 2019 numbers have been quoted now for several years, and these new numbers have come out in conjunction with a high-level meeting on AMR, which show that now the forecasts look for up to 8.2 million deaths associated with AMR by 2050. Which had been a bigger increase, unfortunately, than on the data that had been presented previously. I now present you some data from GARD-P, and we're very happy to have representatives from GARD-P involved in this discussion this afternoon, talking about the lack of new antibiotics that we desperately need in this space, and then work that's recently been done by the WHO, which talks about how what we do have, the very little that we do have coming out of the pipeline, not being appropriate for everything that we need in terms of tackling the severe resistance that we've been discussing in the previous panels today. And then, even when we do have the very few antibiotics that have come out of the pipeline in the last 20 years, work done by some of our key opinion leaders in this space showed that even in high-income contexts, even after registration in high-income contexts of drugs that came out between 2010 and 2020 and that were registered in several high-income contexts, the access to these drugs continues to be severely compromised. And then I'm going to tell you actually the situation is even worse because you can see in this kind of step-up chart this stairway that I've put here of literature that's come out in the scientific space from 2020, which was the year after the bankruptcy of IHEID, talking about why big pharma's abandoned antibiotics, and we heard Prime Minister Motley from Barbados, who led the discussions at the UN high-level meeting, talking about only having 4 big pharma companies left. The paper in the middle in Nature from 2020 also talks about one of the other biotechs, Paratech, and why there is this financial paradox that companies can't afford to create these drugs anymore. And then you see in 2023, I've quoted an article from the Wall Street Journal, which is, that all of us can read, not just the specialist audience that might read Nature, where, we're really talking still about this profitability problem and this market problem in the development of new antibiotics. And then I'm going to tell you the even worse thing, which is that the pipeline is driven completely in the latest WHO work. We talked about 75% of the late-stage pipeline being driven by SMEs, but in the latest work WHO have published on the pipeline, they talk about 93% of the pipeline being driven at this stage by small and medium-sized biotech companies. And they note that many of these are privately funded, and they note that many have limited resources, and that's really the story that we're going to talk about this afternoon, and that's the huge financial challenge in the pipeline. So a nice picture of you, Ryan, from a not very happy moment in your life, probably. Just to highlight, the methodology that we employed, which we heard about from other scholars who've spoken already today about looking into, let's call them in inverted commas, secret spaces. So we know from an academic perspective, not from an industry perspective, but from an academic perspective, it's very hard to understand how much drugs cost to develop. It's very hard to understand the revenues that drugs generate when they are put onto the market, particularly when they're developed in large companies, because a small antibiotic development story will be completely hidden in a bigger company. And so we had to be ingenious in looking at different spaces to try and unpack these. And Ming Wan talked about these kind of data challenges in her work at looking at antibiotic spaces in China as well, and having to go for different sources of information. So combining the clinical trial data and the financial data that we were able to pull together here helped us to elucidate the development path of the drug, but also to match the financial pathway that IHEID took. And one of the reasons we were able to do that was because the team at IHEID chose to go public, to become a public company in 2014, which imposes disclosure requirements on the company. And because so much of their work was focused on plazomicin in that time, we were able to pull out numbers from that development history, which help us to understand the financial aspects of it. We also used investor call transcripts. So as a public company, the management team were talking to investors, and so we call them buy-side people, so the people who buy the shares in the company, and they were also talking to what we call sell-side people, so the bankers that were writing research reports and financial analysis with the company. And by analysing those calls, we could really see what the attitude from the investment world was towards the company as it went through the trajectory post-2014 when it went public. And then, sadly, the bankruptcy reports, and then we contacted several key opinion leaders and other relevant people, some of whom did not want to be identified, in semi-structured interviews to discuss further this and test our methodology and also test our findings. So now I'll show you a few charts from the paper. So this is where we've been able to piece together the data and really split. So the bottom, the bars, the different colours show you how much public, private and philanthropic funding went in and at what stage, and map these to the clinical trial phases. Now this is particularly of interest to people in the access to medicine space who want to really understand how these pathways work and who fund them. But what we typically hear is a discourse which says that public funders fund private industry, pharmaceutical industry privatises the profits. In the antibiotic space, that's absolutely not the case. And in this space, indeed, the private funding that came in was from financial markets. So these are not industry investors in this case. These are financial market investors who came in 2014 in the IPO, or who came in before that as venture capital funders, or who came in afterwards in the public financial markets. And that part is a very important topic that we've put on the table with demonstrating this data, because this dependency of the antibiotic pipeline on capital markets, so the place where you go to raise equity or debt funding, is something that has not been adequately, we believe, understood by policymakers. It's clearly understood by the people who are involved in trying to raise the money. But it hasn't been, we believe, adequately understood, this dependency on the capital market financing, because the discourse around the financial problems and the investment problems in the antibiotic investment ecosystem typically focus around the need for more government funding and the need for more industry involvement. And it ignores the extent to which many of these SMEs are really dependent on convincing financial market investors to continue to invest. And if you look at the peak, if you look at the phase 3 arrow and the peak bar here, and that part of the development trajectory, phase 3 onwards, you see that the dependency on these financial investors increased enormously towards the end of the development history. And you see the yellow bars also, and the yellow bars are the debt financing, and that is also an issue which we believe is not adequately understood by many people who comment on this space, where an SME will raise equity financing from shareholders, but then to get through the big cash flow needs that come as you reach registration and commercialization, you need to go out and raise debt funding, and the debt funding is given by banks or other debt funders as a multiple of the equity that you've already raised. So if you're struggling to raise equity, you can't raise debt. If you can't raise debt, you cannot fund the cash flow needs that you have as you get to the commercialization stage. And that's why we think this chart is incredibly important in elucidating that. When we come to the other side of the story, which is about the ability to generate revenue. So how could you do things differently if you didn't have to go out and raise all the money? It would be because you're making so much money in terms of sales of your drug. We know you can't do that in antibiotics. A new antibiotic, a novel antibiotic, does not need to be sold in vast volumes. It cannot, it should not, because of stewardship. So as IHEID got to 2018 and got FDA approval for the drug, actually the costs increased. So if you look at this going back to 2011, you see that the peak in IHEID's life of the costs came towards the end, and this was exactly the point where revenues were tiny. So the revenues from plazomicin are the teeny tiny box at the bottom, $800,000 in 2018, relative to the costs on the left-hand side with the big bars. And I would point you also to a very important recording of a discussion that Ryan and others involved in this space had in 2019 at the ECSMID conference, where they talk about the costs of doing business. So the costs of doing business being the additional costs once you get approval and once you start to commercialize of many factors, that many obligations that come with the authorization and many needs like setting up manufacturing agreements, those kind of pharmacovigilance topics, and the costs that in that video you talk about $35 million putting together 3 blocks of those costs, for example, that come at that moment, where clearly the revenues from a drug that needs to be protected and a drug where there's a huge pricing problem, which we also discuss in the paper, cannot generate the revenues to cover such costs. And so putting it on paper in this chart, and finally this chart of the acute moment in 2018 after registration, we believe is important evidence that we've contributed to the conversation. So if we talk about, kind of the results of what we found in this paper, and we relate it back to our project, which looks at financialization, we've contributed this empirical evidence. We've contributed charts which enable people who don't look at it from a capital market or financial perspective to understand just how vulnerable SMEs are if they're not able to continue raising money. And the IHEID bankruptcy was really, in a very British expression, a canary in the coal mine. It was seen as projecting an impression to the investment world, industry and financial investors that new antibiotics had zero market value, and it therefore made other investors and other industry investors scared. We had already seen in 2018 other big pharmaceutical companies pulling out of this space completely. And after the bankruptcy of IHEID, several other SMEs went bankrupt too. If we come back to the chart I showed you with all the flags, looking at the registered drugs between 2010 and 2020, 11 of those drugs, I've looked at the clinical trial pathways of all of them, and 11 of those drugs had SME involvement in the pathways to come to registration. They're not all held by, or were not all held by SME companies once they got to the end point, but along the way, SMEs were involved. And I showed you the WHO data that says now that the pipeline's even more dependent on SMEs. So the point of our paper is not about plazomicin per se. The point of our paper really is to understand the financial vulnerabilities of the SMEs and the fact that the pipeline depends on these companies. And that a lot of the policy discussions that we're having at the moment, and some of them are arguments between industry, policymakers, academia, other interested stakeholders in this debate about whether new public money needs to come in, how new public money needs to come in, what kind of pull incentives we need. Our call at the end of the paper is that these discussions also need to factor in the needs of SMEs. Because they are the engine of the pipeline, and that's the contribution that we believe our results make to the policy debates. And we were very excited to see Alex Engels, who's head of one of the biggest funders in this space, picking up interest in our paper and sparking a debate, which I would really encourage any of you to go and look up this post on LinkedIn where he invoked Ryan, and there's been a lot of discussion underneath of even phages as a proposed solution, questions from microbiologists about the mode of action, but a lot of questions about financial aspects. So I'd encourage you to go and look that up. And the other question that we ask in the paper is, can they really all be bad drugs? So I mentioned the number of SME involvements in the 18 drugs that were covered in, up to 2020 approvals. Many of the others faced the same situation as Revagenix faced. And many of those drugs, even when they didn't face the bankruptcy of the SME, are still not accessible today. And we've had medical clinicians talking with us today about the need for really novel new action, the scientific challenges in the pipeline, of course, but we still ask the same question, can they really all be bad drugs? We can't blame the failure of all of those drugs that have come through the pipeline on scientific aspects. The financial aspect really needs to be taken into account. And if we look at the stakeholders between the black outlines here without the red, we talk about government, we talk about industry, and we talk about at the bottom, the health system or the hospitals or, whichever health delivery mechanism. And then we talk about the challenges. So supply and demand is a particular issue for novel antibiotics for the stewardship concerns that I've mentioned. The money piece is what we're really focused on today, and Ryan's going to help us understand better in his keynote shortly. And then my box with the book, that's all about the policy space. So the policy space, which is really an active space being discussed in the US with, talk about the Pasteur Act, huge criticism that's come from multiple parties in the EU of the transferable exclusivity voucher, with the fear that that given to industry would preclude access to other drugs for an extra year, for example, and cost potentially health systems and governments more. So a hugely contested space of these discussions, Japan, Canada, Switzerland, many countries in active discussion, and coming out of the high-level meeting at the UN and the ministerial meeting, which is coming next month, and then action, which we all hope will be taken, and more money, which we hope will come to developing these drugs that we need. Incredibly important that these policy spaces are informed from the perspective of the engineering and innovative engine of the pipeline, which is the SME space. So we made 3 very bold statements in the paper in terms of implications for the antibiotic investment ecosystem. So these are slightly paraphrased. I'd encourage you to look at the paper to see the longest sentence, for example, for number 1, which has caused some, a lot of agreement from people who are in this space, but also is a very, very stark statement that drugs with narrow approval, which plazomicin had, because of the clinical trial challenges in the antibiotic development space, the market in the US, as it is at the moment, with the way the pricing mechanism work under the DRG scheme in hospitals, for example, cannot support the revenues necessary to cover all the costs that I showed you on the charts before. We can't fix the volume problem if we want to do stewardship, so we have to fix something else in that calculation. Is it price? Is it more government intervention? We call for cash flow support for commercialization, and we've given the data so that people can understand just how enormous the cash flow needs at the moment of commercialization and for many years afterwards for SMEs. And where a big company, a big pharma company, can cross-subsidize that with revenues they're making on another drug, an SME developing in this space cannot do that, so needs support. Whether that's, we've discussed briefly in the paper the possibility that there could be other debt type instruments that could be supportive of SMEs based on, for example, subscription agreements which give cash flow guarantees to companies over the longer term. And then this confidence question, I evoked the canary in the coal mine and that legacy of IHEID's bankruptcy, but also the other bankruptcy that's followed, and the lack of access to some of the antibiotics that have come out of the pipeline, even without a bankruptcy situation that we still don't have access to. We do need to restore confidence in the business model to enable more investment to come back into this space. And this, of course, has local, national, and international implications. And we're very happy to have GARD-P here represented as well, who can talk about the access implications globally. So this is not just, this is a high-income context development story, but after the bankruptcy, the rights were bought by Cipla and by a Chinese company, which then transferred them on in 2022. And there have been moves by those companies to try to look at commercialization more recently, potentially in India and potentially in China. And that evokes a question about tying government funding, which came in from biosecurity perspective at the very beginning of the story, tying such funding to stewardship over the long, long term, even if the drug changes hands in its development trajectory. So I would like to thank Professor Harbath at the the Geneva University Hospitals, Professor Nguyen, our funders, the Swiss National Science Foundation, and recognise all the team who've worked on the FINPHARM project over the last 5 years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nadya. I think Nadya will also introduce our next speaker, but once we've had the chance to set up the presentation.
So while Anthony sets up the presentation, I'd just like to say how pleased we are that Ryan Kears, who was at IHEID during this development story, and has been extremely helpful and supportive to me as I developed this case study, and who is still active in the development of antibiotic space, come and talk to us about financial aspects of development and commercialization of novel antibiotics. We're very grateful that he is present here in Geneva with us today, and we are going to make this discussion a resource that can be used afterwards. I referred earlier in my remarks to this 2019 conversation that Ryan had with other developers, which has been a hugely helpful resource in understanding the post-commercialization costs and these costs of doing business, as you call them. And we're going to make this resource after this meeting into a similar source that people can use and refer to as they try to understand and unpack some of these challenges. So thank you very much, Ryan.
Thank you for having me. It was a stroke of luck. I was literally flying out of the city tonight, so I just stayed one day. So I saved myself 10,000 miles. How do I advance this? Sorry. Oh, there we go. Click. Okay. I didn't advance there.
That's good.
All right, slight delay. Okay. I can handle that. I'm going to actually challenge the group to not talk about any companies. Who cares about companies? Companies come and go. They do whatever their investors tell them. I was just looking up Novartis and how much the pension system in this country owns of that company. I don't know what happened.
So how much of the pension system?
So I was just at a meeting with a bunch of students, and it was interesting. It was, I went forwards too much. Gotta go back one. It said, oh, pharmaceutical companies, want to make profits only because their investors make them, and their investors are people that save for retirement, right? And so interconnected in the system is all of us, right? So Novartis does what it does because it's owned by people that want to retire, and they don't want to lose money on their saving, right? And so trying to disconnect this from a company, especially big pharma. I've never worked in there except as an intern 25 years ago when I was a college student. I've always been in small companies, but they kind of get blamed for everything. But let's be honest, if owning the license to sell a novel antibiotic made money, companies will come and do it. If it loses money, they're going to stop. I think we got lucky in the 90s and the early 2000s because they were probably losing a ton of money and just subsidizing those losses with profits from other products. It's not really their job. That's never really worked out well to count on that. When the small companies came in, and obviously I'm a researcher at this time in my life, I still am, right? I only got forced into this due to sort of like inertia to learn about this side of the world. Basically the SMEs exposed to the world what was probably happening this entire time in terms of, and when articles come out and say, you know, pharmaceuticals companies exited because antibiotics are not profitable enough, that's not good enough. They lose you money. They lose you money. It's not about, oh, I'm not making as much over here. And I think the SMEs just showed it, right? Because we couldn't subsidize our losses with sales from other big profitable drugs. And so I appreciate the case study to really get the conversation going again. I think we had a lot of attention on this issue in 2019, and then we had a pandemic 3 months later. So we got to get back to it. But let's be honest, if selling iPhones lost money, Apple would stop selling iPhones. Selling an antibiotic loses you money, everyone would stop selling them. So we got to figure out how to make money again. It can be the littlest amount of money possible, I don't really care, but it can't lose money. It's never going to work. The one thing that's interesting is the more financially successful the product is, especially in an era where we just have a lot of harm, a lot of people got burned and went out, and the kind of solutions I'm seeing are so not even weak tea, they're kind of like hot water with lemon. And when we get into the math, you'll see, you know, we know if we make this exciting for a little while, people will run back and maybe turn the volume down a little bit after that, but we're not doing that. We're kind of doing these really meh kind of incentives. The weird thing is, in most cases in the United States, and I'll focus there first, you know, predominantly, you know, if there's an unmet need, there's really no cases where you can't make a market, because if something's rare, you just price it higher because you're selling less of it, right? And so we'll go through some of that math, and I'm wide open to feedback. Some of the things I'll share today I've never actually talked about, so they could be flawed, and I welcome challenge because it'll make them better. So new antibiotics are sort of unique in that we haven't found a way to make a market in the United States either. So if you look at all of drug development from inception of discovery to the end, you know, we spend money the entire time, and then at the very end, and this is thinking about like a product, right? You make money, and you have a defined period of time to make money quickly before your drug's generic, and then someone else is going to make money off of it. All the work you did, all the research, all the phase 3 trials, all the manufacturing, all the work you did to get people to trust using your drug and know the brand gets leveraged in the generic phase where someone says, I made their thing. It's exactly the same. So we just have that quick window to make back all the money we spent. And to make any drug work, this isn't antibiotics, that purple box has to make enough money to pay back everything you spent. And then you guys are better at math than me with some kind of risk adjustment / time value of money calculation. And we can make those things up top, the spend lower. And we've tried really hard, and FDA was an amazing partner with trying to streamline development. And then this is where, like, you know, the push funding came in. It didn't start as a way to subsidize development. It started as a partnership with the US government to develop our drug for biodefense on top of hospital indications. So it was synergistic. Over time, it's become sort of a lifeline to keep the pipeline moving with the idea that, well, we'll fix the market, everyone don't go. Like, wait, you know, we'll come. And so it didn't start that way though. So like any push funding is reducing those red numbers. But what we proposed in that workshop we'll get to later is, what if you take those numbers to 0? It's still a loss. And that's really forcing the conversation downstream. So it's a great deal because society gets the cheap generic when the market's bigger. Because our market's weird, it's orphan, but it gets bigger because we spread, right? And so when it's biggest, it's cheap. Generics solve it, right? But we need to pay back the investors. It's not about a company. Someone lent me their money, I have to give it back or they won't let me do it again, right? And that's what we're trying to solve. So how do we make money? Well, in this little purple box, the one chance we have to pay everyone back, we need revenue. And it's just based on the price we're charging and the amount we're selling, right? And so what is the volume for our drug? Our drugs are based on days of therapy and the number of people. So we really tend to think in a price per day in this field. For whatever reason, I would love to talk about price per cure. Maybe you all can get that to happen, but it doesn't happen. So if you pick a given indication, say pneumonia, the days of therapy is locked. It's a constant. You can't change that. You can't be like, well, normally you cure pneumonia in a week, but I'm going to treat you for 6 years, right? So we're locked in. So we only have 2 levers, price and number of patients. And there's only one way to make number of patients go up, right? We wait. That's our only option. Or we charge a higher price. And somewhere in there, the world's going to figure that out, and we got to figure out where we want those curves to intersect. Now, you can do a subscription. What is that doing? I will not buy your drug at a high price, you greedy company, but I'll buy a ton more than I need at a low price. Okay, that's super wasteful, but if that's your solution, go for it, right? But it's funny, it's getting us to the same math. How do I pay back the people from the purple box? A low price, to me, when a country sets one, so the United States doesn't set your price, right? You can set any price, and now no one will use it, but you can set it. When someone sets a low price, you can solve backwards and say, you're telling me don't come here until I have this many people that have AMR, and we'll work through that, right? So really briefly, because I have to get to new content, just to perspective. So Acaogen, 20 years ago, founded. I was at Scripps Research Institute. My thesis advisor was one of the founders. Really, the hallmark things were 20 years ago. It was not me. I was, early graduate student, like second year student. It was the first CEO that really said, I think gram negatives are where things are going to be at. So the type of bacteria we're worried about now, which is pretty visionary 20 years ago. Normally you predict something like that. Like imagine if you had a COVID drug in like 2018. So that was very visionary. And then really it was I think the median size through most of its history was about 45 people. Had ups and downs, just because we had the Great Recession. We were only larger towards the end as you're building the infrastructure to commercialize, right? So we're a pretty ragtag team. And we put 4 homegrown programs, meaning our chemists in our labs made the drug for the first time. We didn't buy it from someone through INDs in the space, which is more than any large pharmaceutical company. So it's prolific. Obviously, plazomicin gets all the focus because that's the case study. I won't definitely not cover this. I left it because I do walk through this to students a lot to show like the trauma of, especially the sequence at the end. Everything's amazing and then bankruptcy. But I needed this for 2 things because I'll need to reference back to them. The 2 phase 3 trials that got us to market were a mortality superiority study in life-threatening infections due to carbapenem-resistant Enterobacteriaceae called the CARE study that was initiated, I think, in 2014, so 10 years ago. And then in the end, actually, the registrational study was a non-inferiority complicated urinary tract infection study comparing to meropenem. There's a lot of history in there, like how this all happened, and this is the part where the FDA really helped and got everything to fix. That we had to do things the way we did, there's no time to talk about, but at least you have those 2 anchor points. So, here's the NASDAQ ticker. So the phase 3 data comes out and everyone's excited. The stock actually, it was $1 billion company. That's probably still an SME these days, but it was $1 billion public company in 2017. So the data's out. It takes about a year to get to the NDA and the decision. And the entire time we're slowly sliding during the decision. I think one thing that always gets left out, I don't know why, is there was massive short selling. Like we had 2 main shareholders that weren't selling shares and we were falling dramatically. And you could actually go to NASDAQ and look up the short interest on any given day. But it wasn't just us, it was all 3 public companies. So there were people naked shorting the companies, driving their prices down, which as you said, that means we can't raise money. Because if your price falls, you can't sell, right? And so that was another interesting thing. But the hedge funds were 100% right. They shorted and made hundreds of millions of dollars out of the 3 companies, probably. So why were they right? So this became a passion of mine. So all through this period, I'm just doing research. It is my startup baby, so I'm studying. I used to say I stick my nose places that didn't belong because I care. I was interested. But I definitely wasn't thinking about the end game. I thought approval and you're a winner, especially with good data. In 2018, it became clear to me, like, it's not, like, I'm worried. And so I proposed to put on a workshop that all my colleagues actually presented everything. And the link is here because there's not going to be time to go through it. So I'm going to have to jump to some conclusions that you'll have to go do your homework and you can go to the workshop. But it's 2 hours long. GuardP has hosted it. We picked the conference because we knew they would video Carbix and GuardP and archive it. It's also on YouTube, but it's not chaptered as nicely. And the thesis was actually, and what stimulated this was I was at the same meeting in 2018, and people were starting to say like, well, what if we did smaller phase 3 trials or used adaptive statistics? I'm like, I think you could get to market for free and you'd still be burned. And I was like, I'm gonna put on a workshop to show that math, right? And get my colleagues. And this workshop was not just about plazomicin. These people had worked on 3 recently approved antibiotics, 2 of them at large companies, right? So that's important. This is not a one-off. And the summary of the workshop, basically, all we did was try to document cost after approval. So if I said to Nadya, I just got this drug approved, here, you hold it. You got the license to sell it. This is what you'll owe, right? It's the cost that is tied to holding the license. And so there's a laundry list of liabilities and expenses that you're on the hook for. And the important thing we did, because in this period of time, everyone was saying, well, if the small companies just combined, they're being selfish, why don't they just combine forces into one bigger company? Every cost we talked about in this workshop was per product. We didn't put employee costs in. We didn't put, because if I got 3 products, I can manage that with a team that's only a little bigger than 1 product. These were individual per product costs. And this is what I mean about iPhones and people not wanting to sell them. These are the individual costs of doing this with 1 asset. And so we kind of cut to the bare bones because I'm sort of a reductionist, to just get people to focus. And there's no salespeople in this, right? There's no marketing. You're assuming that's not happening because I knew that would be used against us to say, oh, it's all salespeople. So it's really important per product. And this happens to every drug, but there's some things with antibiotics that make it harder and worse. But on the cost side, these are pretty normal. And in front of the room with the heads of regulatory and all these people, no one argued that there's nothing in this pile we want you to stop doing, right? And your costs seem reasonable. It's just that most drugs make so much money after they get approved, no one cares about this stuff. Like I was making $2 billion a year and I got to spend $400 million. I'm like, whatever, it's not a big deal. And so we're not making any money. We'll get to that later. This is something kind of new that I've been kind of obsessed over lately, learning from others, is I feel like we're mixing up costs. So let's talk about two kinds of costs. There's unit costs, like, okay, I can make a drug for $50 a vial, and we'll get into why the kinds of drugs we make are expensive too later. And say I can sell it for $100, well, that's $50 profit. That's great. But the fixed costs are what are drowning us. They're absolutely drowning us. And that's those liabilities. If I give you the license, you owe this now. And so the question is, how many $100 vials do I have to sell to pay for a $50 million post-marketing commitment? Well, $1 million, because to make $50 a vial. Now, I don't have time to walk through all of this. I had it in here, but in the taxi, I was like cutting, I'm like, I want to be on time. But really important is each new region you enter adds new fixed costs. Now, it's not the same. It's not the 420 million for every one, but I think you really got to understand this because when I do my calculus, we are not developing in Europe at my new company because you could just do the math and say the added fixed cost is nowhere near the value that we calculate we would get because it's a segregated market with multiple entry points. And so that's something I want to study more and I may present on in February in Basel. We'll see. Okay, unit costs real quick. So a couple of nuances. So our drug substance, so that's the powder. You're doing chemistry and you end up with like this, it looks like a pile of white powder, right? Hopefully white, if it's pure. And so that's your drug substance. Now most high impact, and I mean like the life-saving for the really gnarly infection, gram-negative drugs, are pretty complex structures. They're either unstable or highly soluble, hard to purify, really complicated syntheses. So they're usually pretty expensive cost to synthesize it. Now, the bigger you scale, you can get it down, but it's hard, right? A lot of the older drugs we were just fermenting from because they're natural products. So they're hard to make, but another big thing is we give huge doses. So in my hand there, this is from an old student talk, in the upper right, is a Lipitor dose versus piperacillin, right? It's actually sodium chloride for both, but the point is to show you, look how much more you have to make to dose someone one day with mine versus theirs. And mine's harder to make. So that's a challenge. We can overcome it with investment, but we're starting from a harder place. Another thing, and honestly, I've been learning about this more as I've re-entered the space post-Keynote, is I knew always, but most antibiotics, especially beta-lactam antibiotics, have to be segregated away from other products. You're not allowed to get them anywhere near each other because there's fear, especially for beta-lactams that you could have anaphylaxis and little. There was a drug recently that just had to withdraw a non-antibiotic because some beta-lactam got in it or suspected to get in it from another product. So what does that do? So I can't make my drug near anyone else's. Why fewer choices? What does fewer choices get you? Higher prices because there's less competition. So that's another unique thing in our space. The other thing that's new to me is some of the people I used to work with don't do antibiotics anymore because there's been no one coming to give them the business to make them to bother to sign the agreement with the person saying like, hey, I don't want any antibiotic made near my cancer drug. Where's the economic pressure for them to say, no, let's talk about this. I still want to make antibiotics too. There's no one asking them, so sure, I'll sign that. No antibiotics in my factory. So we're losing more and more on the premium side, on the high quality manufacturing side. So people that used to be able to make my products can't make them anymore because they signed an agreement saying they won't, because why wouldn't they? Because there's no demand to make new antibiotics. And we're talking like new branded, kind of higher price volume. So that's kind of been shifting in our space. The other really important thing, and as a scientist early in my career, I had no idea. I assume a pill's way harder to make. I mean, you gotta smush it, you gotta swallow it, you gotta get the release profile right. It's not. The most, and plazomicin, you dissolve it in water and put it in a glass vial. That's the most expensive kind of manufacturing. Anything that gets injected into your body or inhaled. And so it's sterile manufacturing. And GARP is doing a great job, I think, trying to get ahead on educating on that's a base cost that's expensive. It's even expensive, in more inexpensive, manufacturing countries. I think the stories I've heard is you can't walk through the factory and like wave to your friend because you just disturb the airflow, right? Like it's a really regulated manufacturing. And so that's basically one of our big challenges. And then you can repeat the segregation issues too. Like you can't put them near each other. So I worry, and I'm going to work on this, hopefully with some help from people that are a lot smarter than me. Like we're trying to solve for what is the floor price to fill a glass vial with water. I mean, not water because you could fill 1 billion of them, but, and I think we got to figure that out quickly because I think there's some countries that are asking for prices, because I'm passionate about getting the drug there at cost for new stuff we're doing, that they're asking for prices that I couldn't fill the vial with water. And I don't know how they're getting it for that price under GMP. And so we need to figure that out as a community, because if they can't afford the floor price that groups like you all support is the floor, then we've got to find another mechanism, like a pool procurement or something like that. But the other really interesting thing, this is a new thought, is this scale paradox. So every time I want to fill my product, so like here's a picture with the glass vials getting filled up, there's a fixed cost. It's hundreds of thousands of dollars. You know, it changes on scale, and I haven't commercialized the drug personally, but it's expensive. You're cleaning the facility, you're setting up, winding down, because you're going to fill someone else's drug next month. Unless you want to have a dedicated facility for your drug, and I don't even want to know what that would cost. So each time you want to fill a vial with your drug, first of all, there's the setup cost, so that's going to increase your fixed cost. There's waste, there's dead volume, all those tubings and things, you're not going to use that. You're going to flush it out and get rid of it. And then actually I do, right as we enter the clinic with a new program, the largest quantity of drug goes to basically throwing it away to prove you're sterile. Now as you scale, a fixed amount of that goes towards release, testing, and all the things you have to do to prove that batch is good. But you can imagine the smaller you are, the more significant the fraction of the batch is just to prove you can release the batch. So there's this interesting paradox that as you go to larger scale, things get cheaper. Which I know economies of scale, but this is a very visceral, like, you know, it costs this much to turn on the line. If you fill 2 million vials, it costs that much. If you fill 2 vials, it costs that much, right? So that's really important for people to know. The other thing that's new to me is I hadn't thought about, if you get to really large scale, there's cheaper manufacturing technologies that waste a ton of your drug substance, your powder, and if it's really valuable and expensive, it's hard to use those technologies, but this is where there's this crossover point where if I knew people needed enough of it, I could actually make it a heck of a lot cheaper for multiple reasons. And that's why sort of, and groups like RP are great about this. You know, if we had, like I've been saying Revagenix, if our company had a commitment to know for sure that when we got to market, someone would buy the drug at cost plus 6%, whatever it is, 10%, some de minimis thing, I could invest to get the cost down for all my markets, which means my margins are better in but if I do it at risk with no promise, I'm going to make my life even, like, how risky is that to do after everything we're dealing with already in our field? So I hope we can get this conversation going early, because the next generation of drugs, we could do this. We just need that handshake that you're not going to walk away if I build the capacity. You'll buy it at cost plus or whatever. I think that's an exciting way to synergize need and LMICs and getting our costs down for our commercial markets. You know, instead, I think because of this crisis, I'm confident. I don't know what everyone's doing. I don't know what they're probably building the most bare bones supply chain possible to keep the cost down to sell into an ultra orphan market, likely in the United States. That's probably what most developers are doing in this next generation. Because we don't have that commitment, we can't take this risk on. We're really in a tough spot. And the graph is just showing Abicaz overall, I mean, it certainly got to the other side of the commercial side. It's not doing $1 billion. It's not going to excite people to run into the field, but you know, it's used a lot, right? Everyone thinks these were the 2021 days of therapy and millions of days of therapy for Abicaz compared to IV quinolone or oral quinolone. So, right, like they have a massive disadvantage on scale of days of therapy of use. And this is a successful product. Can you imagine one that's like barely selling, right? It's like it's going to be even tinier. And so there's this interesting thing that if we had commitments for volumes, even at cost, we could actually do a lot better for everybody. So the workshop, which I couldn't go through, you'll have to fact check it on your own, but basically what it documented was after multiple launches, obviously plazomicin, we don't have this type of data because we didn't have 7 years post-launch. You actually, if you zero the planes at approval, you lose about $420 million in the first 7 years after launch. And this is probably what was happening in most pharmaceutical companies. Now, it doesn't mean that you didn't get to the other side, but time value of money, it's a deep hole. And profitability in year 7 meant you could pay your year 7 bills in year 7. It didn't mean you could pay back your year 6 bills or 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Never mind the cost to get the drug to market. So we spent a lot of time at that workshop that's on the internet to define the cost and not talk about revenue, because we want to just like, everyone agree, is this fair? Is this the cost? We did it at Bio the next year to talk about revenue. Unfortunately, it was 2020, so it was there. We were online and I had no idea. We were talking into a void. But you know, honestly, let's be straight, the revenues are horrible. Our costs, we've documented, anyone can challenge them from that workshop and we will adjust the numbers, but those are the costs. And we said, do you want us to not study the drug in pediatrics? Do you want us to not make it GMP? Do you want it, and no, do all that. Okay, well, this is what it is. Now we gotta talk about, we gotta balance the other side of the equation, the revenue. So this is the exact same figure, just for a visual reminder. We gotta make money in this pretty tight window. And we only can control price or number of patients. And the only way I can control number of patients is to try to time it so there's a lot of them when I get there. That's all I can do. So I just wait, don't develop until there's a lot. And again, this reminder of when a country sets a low price, because the country set, you know, in the US it's my fault if I set it low or high. That's telling me don't come here till there's this many people. And you can almost back sell for that. So this is something I just practiced the other day with the group. So this has been tested a little bit, but you know, let's work through the math. So if we said it took $500 million to get to an NDA from beginning to end, which is, you know, I think that's very achievable now, thanks to the FDA working with the companies to streamline. And we have the post-market costs, right? So let's just pretend we're at launch and someone gave us almost $1 billion free loan, right? 10 years ago when we started all this, right? Because that's about how long to get to the approval. And we have 10 years left before our patent runs out, because that's pretty normal. That's kind of like a normal, Advocaz isn't out yet, but it's pretty soon, a few more years, not 10 for sure. And so we have 10 years left to make all that money back and pay them back. So how would we price? And that's going to depend on the market size and the days of therapy. So here I'll kind of focus on the US, and I'll start with a market size of 30,000 patients annually, because that's kind of what Plazo launched into with carbapenem-resistant enterobacteriaceae, right? 30,000. So with this type of resistance, let's just pretend it's some new resistance, but a market size similar to what we faced, you get a third of them on your drug, because I think that's a pretty fair and reasonable and aggressive assumption, honestly. Because these are, you don't even know these are like observational numbers, but like the fact that you catch every single case and get them on your drug is low, plus assume there's at least one competitor. And then let's say a median of 6 days. So, you know, in our space, like UTI probably dominates, and then there's definitely some pneumonia, but that kind of medians out to 6 days of therapy. Baseline cost, we can go back to the $50 a vial, and we can debate this. It's not $5 a vial if it's GMP. It could be like 30 or 40, but you know, $50 per vial cost. So this is the drug substance making the thing with all the complicated chemistry and actually putting it in the, but then I picked a drug that's sort of more similar to like imiropenem, Advocaz, Zerbaxa, 2 vials per dose, Q8 hours, so 3 times a day. So then you got a base cost of $300. Now, if you invest a ton of money, you can bring that down, but that's a balance too. Like, do I invest another 50 million and bring it down? Or depends. So what do we have to charge per day to get that back? So if you work through this, and we pretend this is the US market, so 920 million, 10 years to do it, 30,000 patients, a third of them, 6 days. I got to make $1,533 per person per day, right? If I add my cost, then it's $1,833. And I called it the take-home price, which is a made-up word. And I say that because it's another chapter of my life to understand this, don't understand US pricing. But the bottom line is I have to make it feel like I charge $833. I probably priced it at $2,500, and then the PBM does what it does. And but that's what I got take home. At least Europe there, it's way easier. It would be the $1,833. But if I did that for the next 10 years, I could pay back what I borrowed 20 years earlier, even money, with no interest, no risk adjust for the return on investment. Like they could have lost it too if I failed in phase 3, right? And so that's what the math says there. So some more fun math, just for fun, if we took the same price per day and the same number of patients and the same percent of the market and said, what if it took me 15 months to treat you instead of 6 days? It's an $8.2 billion drug. I mean, you're halfway to Humira, right? Just because it takes me 15 months instead of 6 days to treat you. Then I flip it again and I say, well, what if we're still curing you in 6 days, but now I wait till there's 3 million patients? That's a $10 billion drug at that price. Wow, that'd be amazing. So you can see the conundrum we're in. Which one do we do? So we wait. Then I flip it again and I say, let's take Advocaz's EU launch price. I think it's still the price today of $330 a day. And you would make $1.8 million with this market. And it would take you 51 years to pay back the loan. with only 10 years of patent life left, because they're only netting $30 a day per patient. Now, maybe their costs are lower because they invested crap tons in the CMC program. It's very possible, but I don't know. Now, let's look at one last time. How many patients do we need to be in the EU to get to my 92 million a year? So if I'm like, I'm going to base my market on Europe, it's a big place, bigger than the United States, more people, more resistance for sure. If I want to make my 92 million a year, which is not a blockbuster drug by any means, right? Then I've got to wait with that margin for 1.5 million people to have my disease, to be able to pay back my loan with no interest and no return on investment. And then I looked up, just in the right here, what are the cumulative COVID deaths in Europe since the beginning of the pandemic? It's about the same number, right? So I got to wait till there's a pretty big market. If you're telling me 330 is the price and my COGS are 300, and maybe that's not right, maybe the COGS are 250 and I'm wrong, you're telling me I can't come until you got over 1 million people. You could just back solve. All right, so then this is the last piece, like, could Plazo have been useful, right? And it's a fair play to say, like, that drug was, plenty of people, I'm sure, have been like, oh, it must have failed because it wasn't useful, right? And maybe they're right. I will say, when I was with the commercial team, still with the Achaeogen, because we had about 8 months before the bankruptcy, 95% of the formularies put it on. They were like, yeah, we should have this on formulary. In the US, we had that problem where they won't want to use it because the price is high and there's no reimbursement in the hospital, right? So we're facing that challenge, but they let you try, right? You can try. Europe, it's just like they set it low and I'm like, you're doomed. And that's why you saw people pull their applications. Like, I can calculate this is net zero, negative. So I talked about the trials. There was a whole history behind us struggling to enroll one. So I want to be transparent about that, but there's no time to talk about it. But the CARE study, and this will be important in a minute, which is the mortality superiority study, we stopped too early, but we didn't know it because we didn't know how different the drugs were, and we were taking years to enroll this thing. But there was pretty profound results. Not enough to power it, superiority, yes, but not enough to power it to the pre-specified power to claim, like, the indication, get the FDA approval on it. And that's why the FDA sort of reformed and let us do this other trial. But really profound difference in activity of Plazo versus Colistin. It'll become important in a minute. And then, of course, other things, like, the reason we tried to still get approval for this was, well, we met the margin, we didn't have the power, but every other indicator pointed towards Plazo. There's less bacteria in your bloodstream after you take it. You don't go septic. All the other secondaries. But to be fair, we had said, at this power, we will show this difference when we started the trial years earlier, and we weren't able to show that. If we had let it run for like another 2 months, it probably would have powered, but we were thinking we were much closer, and we would have had to run it for another like 6 years. So you don't know until you go blind for these kinds of studies. The really interesting thing to me was, these are really, really sick people. That's why the trial was so hard. You have to get people sick enough they could die, but not so sick they can't be saved, which is a really defined window, because otherwise your statistics are messed up. But if you looked at the study in time, and this is a New England Journal paper now, in the drug treatment window, because these people could have cancer, they could have been in a car accident, they had a stroke. In the drug treatment window, when you're on antibiotic, which is only the first 14 days, the lines completely separate. 100% survival versus 75, right? Then you stop treating the infection and you see people die over 60, and the lines should actually follow each other because it's not the infection anymore, right? This is perfect. I thought the combination of all these things might get us this indication. I don't think it would have mattered economically in the long run, now that I look back. But so compelling data, it'll become important in a second. And then the EPIC study was really the urinary tract infection study. So these are serious urinary tract. You might have bacteria in your bloodstream, you got a kidney, you're in the hospital, but it is urinary tract. It's not as extreme mortality as the other trial. I get that. Ironically, US and Europe differ in their endpoints a little bit based on the study design. Another cost that would add to my program if I added Europe right now to my current plans, because they don't totally agree. So I got 2 different plans. But basically, the bottom line is the drug met its margins, but actually, ironically, in Europe, it was superior to all of the endpoints. So actually, the claim could have been, if it were launched, plazomicin is superior to meropenem for the treatment of UTI. And mind you, these are trials where meropenem is active. Like, we're gaming it to make sure you're not allowed to put resistance to your comparator in your trial. So this is beating meropenem when meropenem works perfectly well. So I say ironically because that's the region it's not available in, right? But it actually would have been superior. Also ironically, this study was, sorry, I forgot the flag, I shouldn't have done it. Oh, wow, we're going backwards. There's significant lag, I apologize. Okay, I'll get to that later. Just a couple more slides. Damn, that takes a while. Okay. So here's a couple arguments. Could it have been useful? And I'm open to people saying, nah, I'm glad it's gone, whatever. It's not gone. It's available in the US and it's on the market in India, right? And I don't know about China, actually. I honestly don't. So here's, as a scientist, a discovery scientist that thinks about risk and strategy and evolution. Since 1996, there's only been 2 drugs approved for UTI or HAPAP for gram-negatives. Revagenix in 1996 when I was in high school, and plazomicin. Okay? Every other drug on this list is beta-lactam, which is fine. Beta-lactams are awesome. They're awesome, but that's all we've been doing. There's a lot of scientific and regulatory reasons that there's no time. It's a warning. And as an evolutionary biologist, we have only gotten plazomicin and a whole bunch of beta-lactams approved, and everything in the pipeline, not everything, but everything coming really soon, are all more beta-lactams. And there's some intricacies to why, scientifically and regulatorily, there's no time, but it's a warning. This was the one different thing, the only different thing since I was in high school when it came to the market. All right, so why does it matter? You know, this is interesting data because we're doing stuff on our new programs, and so it's making me look into the world. And so carbapenem resistance in India right now, it's about 15% all-comer. So this is 0% Miro because this is carbapenem resistant. I'm looking at that population, so this is like which drugs work. Abicaz and Vapomir, the 2 drugs approved the same time as we were, don't work at all. And we kind of knew. Like, okay. Avibactam was a shock. That's like a brand new drug. It's like just approved for this exact problem, and we kind of know what's going on there. I'll show in a sec, or we think. Funny enough, gentamicin is beating 2 of the new agents, which means I can't tell you what plazomicin is because it wasn't in the background data, but I know it's at least the same as gen. So it's somewhere between 42 and 100% active. I have no idea. If we include it in our future studies, so these are background data to prepare the study, not to actually, we haven't run our novel stuff yet, but if we include plazomicin, we'll be able to tell you the real rate. But it's kind of ironic. There are 3 new agents in that exact window, Abicaz, Vapomir, plazomicin, and I can promise Plazo is the most active. I just can't tell you if it's 42 or 100, but it's not on the market. Well, it is in India, actually. So who cares? Oh, it's in India, whatever. And sorry, the lag's gonna kill me on this because of the build. So I heard about this new thing, which is the Astrinum resistance 13 months ago, and I couldn't believe it. Because as you know, I know that pipeline where I'm like, everything's the same. What if something came that did, and the mechanism behind this is wiping everything out. Then there's a case report in Stanford Hospital, so right by me, of this particular type of resistance that in January of this year, at ECCMID, I'm running around at all the posters, you find this poster. Actually, 20% of the carbapenem-resistant E. coli in Sweden have this genotype, just no one was looking. And now that Astrinum is coming to market, people are saying, oh, this isn't working? We haven't even used it yet, what's going on? Then Brian Shields just published, when I was at ECCMID, 5 case reports, sorry, it's taking forever, in Pittsburgh. So Stanford, Pittsburgh, Sweden. So this has been spreading. Probably we weren't noticing because if you see an NDM E. coli from India, you're like, oh, yeah, it's resistant to Abicaz, Vapomir, Plazo, whatever. But now the new thing doesn't work, and you're like, what is this? And then this just came, I added it actually while I was sitting there before because you all were talking about conflict. Foreign fighters evacuated from Ukraine. Somehow this got there. All the other cases were travel associated, right? That it made sense. I have no idea. The big thing with this, and I'm not showing all of the data because some of it's are like new, what we'll publish, and I just don't have it organized. If you are this phenotype, this is Astrinum, it generally often correlates with cefiderocol and cefepime-10 or Revagenix resistance. So we're talking about a drug that was most recently approved after the first 2 years, then one that is just approved like today, and then one that's not yet approved but going to be probably next year. It's already resistant, they're not on the market because we've got this homogeneity in our pipeline. So it's a huge, huge risk to the world. So last piece, watching the clock closely. So, all right, this is a case report, a claim I can try to make, but no one can prove anything here. Like, could plazomicin have been useful in Europe today? So the thing I'll focus on is there have been no antibiotics approved for the metallo-beta-lactamases that we heard a little bit about earlier in this time period. Because we have, Plazo was great versus colistin, but then Abicaz and Vapomir came in. We don't need Plazo, who cares? Well, this mechanism they don't treat. So let's just look at that. So the challenge was, it was really bad luck. When the first NDMs we heard about earlier, so that's a type of this enzyme, were found, they co-traveled with this mechanism that wipes out Plazo. And just permanently in people's heads, they were like, plazomicin doesn't work on NDM producers. And it's 2 different genes that happen to be together, and they could separate or they could stay together forever, right? So so basically that sort of set the stage that it doesn't work. So 2019, I don't have the reference, but I can find it if anyone needs it. You could Google it. So a last surveillance study published that said of all the global isolates of NDM producers, Plaza is active on 75%. Now, is that good enough as one of the developers of it? No, I want it to be 99, but it's better than anything on the planet at this point in time, right? But what I did was phone a friend while I was in Annecy and said, can you give me the rate? Because I'm not doing a current surveillance study in Europe. I already did mine, and now I'm doing, focused Asia. And I said, tell me the percent of NDM producing CRE that don't have the thing that hits Plaza. It's 92%. In Greece right now this year. 92% of patients that have an NDM infection are susceptible to plazomicin. So why did I bring up Greece of all the places, right? That's where we were in the damn trial 10 years ago. That's where we showed this mortality benefit. In Greece, right? That was the #1 enrolling country. So I just want to throw out a possible uncomfortable truth is that since the end of the CARE trial 10 years ago, or 8 years ago for the end, patients in Greece, which have a high incidence of NDM positive infections, have no access to this drug. We know the mortality difference between what they're getting, because it's colistin, that's really the only option, and plazomicin. And we know from our phone a friend that 92% of the NDM producers are plaza susceptible. So there's definitely a possibility this drug isn't useful and it's not on the market, and so be it. Good riddance, right? There's a possibility for the past 6 years since we launched it in the US, it could have launched it in Europe, but ultimately, it wasn't even a Cajun at that point, it was a new owner, which I think was very validating. The new owner came in and said, whoa, no, bad math, pull it out. It could have been saving people's lives in this particular country and really anywhere else where there's NDM and not the other thing, right? And I don't know all the numbers all over. So I think it had a space, and I think it could have been rewarded by being financially successful, but I think no one really understood how raw and gnarly the math was when we were doing all this, right? So why I'm here to try to keep explaining it. So that's really it. Approval is a death sentence, and no one can prove otherwise. Like, whiteboard the math. You get the liabilities, you can't generate meaningful revenue at the prices payers want to pay for they're really almost gene therapies. 5 days for an ultra orphan. Gene therapy is 1, maybe 2 actually. So they're really similar. Good news is, not good news, but good news for society benefit, it won't be orphaned for very long. But by the time it's a massive problem, it's generic. We just got to figure out a way to pay the investor back for making the thing for everybody, for the generic and for us, right? And there's lots of effort to talk about fixing it, but it's just sort of funny. Nothing has really stood out. It's like, wow, we're stepping up like we did during COVID. Not anywhere near, not within 2 orders of magnitude of taking it as seriously as we need to. And then the last piece is like, now that I've dug in, because it made me think, well, did we ever even need this thing? We had the other new ones. Well, yes, there was a 6-year window, and now maybe aztreonimab will solve everything, or maybe that new E. coli will emerge, and we're back to colistin only. And it's kind of crazy. Plaza is sitting there with all the trials done, and all the money spent, not on the European market, simply because the price was going to get set too low.
Thank you very much.
That was fascinating, right? Thank you. So we're going to open up the floor for questions, discussions. I think we have 30 minutes.
Yeah, sorry, I used 2 extra.
No, that's okay.
So I have a question. Just to summarize, essentially, you explained very clearly about that window where you have to make your money back. And the problem here is that the numbers are too small, right? It's a niche market.
For how fast we cure.
Yes.
If you treat long, which is why NTM drugs are being successful, because you treat for 15 months, that's why I use that number. So the drug approved right after us is going to make $1 billion a year. Antibiotic.
Right.
Yeah, so if we want to do the indications where the cure is fast, that's our problem.
But isn't there a higher risk of resistance with a longer treatment?
Well, that's required clinically. Like that disease, that's why I'm saying once you pick your indication, like am I treating urinary tract or sepsis, or am I treating that particular disease, has to take that long to treat, which is why you're seeing investment there. It's still an antibiotic, but it proves to you guys, like the mathematicians, that, oh, we just got to solve that multiplier.
But so why, I mean, this problem was always there. What was new that made this a problem with this particular, because there've always been small diseases with small numbers.
Well, I guess give me one so I can compare it. Sorry, just to, give me an example of a small disease you're thinking of, just so I can compare it.
Well, I mean, any of those orphan diseases that were put under the Orphan Act.
Well, interesting.
Autoimmune disease, rare.
Most of those are chronic, right?
Okay.
So I think where we're starting to face the same problem as gene therapy. What if it's orphan, but you cure it really quick? That's essentially what we are.
Okay.
How did antibiotics get away with it before? We didn't just treat the resistant infection. We said, stop using the old one, just use me. Give me volume, right? And we don't want to do that anymore. And we thought we were doing the right thing, saying only use it for the resistant one. And we didn't realize we orphaned ourselves without a solution. But the original orphans were chronic treatment. I mean, most of them still today, anything not a gene therapy is chronic. For the rest of your life, you're taking it. So then you see the math, how it would escalate.
Plus, what you said was that in the old days, the big pharma would cross-subsidize with more profitable drugs, the development of these newer drugs.
I mean, you have to make, either they found a magical way to make those costs go away, which is hard to believe, or they had to be losing money. Depending, I mean,
the losses were buried in the very high margins they were getting on Lipitor.
Well, the volumes were, I mean, Piptazo I've studied, and Piptazo, when it was in its last year of being a branded antibiotic, was a blockbuster drug.
Yeah. I
And
think at some
then
point,
within 4 years, the revenues had gone from nearly $1 billion, 900 and something, to 300 and something.
Yeah.
Because generic competition came in the year after they took over, Pfizer took it over.
Yeah.
So.
But I'm talking like, if you go backwards, Abicaz, Revagenix, so 2010, like those were developed. Cetaralen's a good example. I think their pediatric trial sat open for a decade because no one wants to enroll it. You're just paying sites to sit there, wasting money because you have to do it by law. Those were within big company. Like recently, those are the last ones. And then it was all to the SMEs and we just, whoa, this is what's been going on. No wonder they exited. We're yelling at them for exiting because it's not making enough money. No, that wasn't right. Now, it's also possible our markets are even smaller than theirs were, right? And, it all depends on timing. The big question is like, should we develop something for a 30,000 patient US market or not? I'm being told no, because the price tells me no, wait for more. But I think people don't really understand that. I'm like, you're telling me don't come yet, because your price is so low I can't sell for zero, just keep it to zero.
But are you making an argument, I mean, in a sense, not you necessarily, but this is making an argument for an alternative market mechanism of some sort, other than, pricing, a different way of pricing. So a subscription, all the stuff that's being studied by Dina, for example. Subscription models like hepatitis C, Sabosvir, these other solutions.
I mean, the purple box has got to get to the right number. Right? And what's the best way to do that without causing abuse? But it's the flat truth. You got to get the purple box to the right number. And it probably can't be to zero, right? It's got to be to something above that to return the risk and all that. And you guys are better at solving that.
Damian, do you want to maybe talk about Dericol and GARP and how you've thought about access and maybe some of these challenges in the plan for that?
Well, thank you. Great presentation with refreshing insight. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it seemed to me that you were hinting at the fact that sort of innovative financing mechanisms such as price or volume guarantee, could be the solution. That's what I seem to have guessed, but I don't know if that's what you really meant.
Well, it's kind of two things. It's both. I mean, I don't have an opinion for the high-income markets. It's like however you want to solve it. I do think it's a little silly to be like, let's buy way more than we need at a low price because we just refuse to pay a high price. But whatever. I'm talking about, we know the need in the low and middle-income countries and other places is higher. And I know the I can't say for everybody. I can say for me. If I knew, I would give my drug away at cost, like something that just doesn't hurt me, to those countries if I just knew they needed it. And then I can focus on my other markets. But if I don't tell me now, and I'm sure GARP's based on some of this, because when the first time I met people from GARP when it formed, they were like, we're interested in plazomicin for, I'm like, we built our supply chain, like we have to go, and you have to go back. You can't just be like, oh, let's just grow it. You got to revalidate it with the FDA. So like the planning ahead thing is what I was talking about for LMICs. And that's only if we get it to market. If we don't get it to market, don't do anything. But by not having confidence anyone wants the volume at whatever we can make it for, because we can't go below cost or we're in trouble, we can't build it bigger for no reason, right? So there's two things. For the LMICs, I'm thinking about how do we get that commitment only if we deliver, but it's got to be something that doesn't harm us, and we can build it bigger and not have to go back and revalidate all of our processes with the regulators, right? Because your approval is your manufacturing process. It's approved with the phase 3. It's not like you just don't go change it. And so we're so lean, we're not incorporating it, and it's going to be more wasteful to go back, and GARP is going to do some great work, I'm sure, having to go back and correct and make new supply chains for some of the products. Because they weren't built to accommodate that population at the approval.
Is there a way to partner on that part of the problem? So, when we talk about the financial, and we talked about in the paper, the Big Pharma pulled out. Big Pharma is therefore not a financial mechanism. It's not a financial pull mechanism to bring innovators and financing from financial investors into the system, because there had been a hope that, like in other drug areas, you get bought out at the end. The exit would come with a financial transaction into Big Pharma, which has rarely come in this space, but has come in some of the pipeline we talked about. But could another piece instead be that pharma environments that do have that distribution and manufacturing capability could come in and partner at that stage to help with this problem in a different way, not in a money, not in a buyout of everything. So the innovation can still happen in the SME, but the pipes to then get what you've innovated out to the world, somehow there's a different economic model for that could work.
They can help. We could do it by ourselves too. We need the market maker. Who's buying it?
Right.
And can they
So
buy
it
it for
doesn't
above
solve
cost?
that problem. Yeah.
If we want, of course, I'd rather not go through a full 15-year, but we can do it by ourselves. We've done it more times than Big Pharma.
Yeah.
But of course, we would take the help if we could get it. But I go back to make my drug an iPhone, and someone will want to sell it, and then they will start acquiring again. The best, as an entrepreneur, the most efficient, if you can do all the work yourself, meaning you don't need help for a while, the best exit point is phase 3 ready. Why is that? Phase 3 is easy to run now, thanks to the FDA and all the reforms. My manufacturing process is approved in the phase 3 study. And the person that's going to manufacture the drug for the long haul should have control over how we do that and where we do that. That was always the efficient handoff point, like Abicaz, Zerbaxa, when those were acquired, because those were acquired assets, they were acquired right in that kind of spot. I've de-risked everything clinically. This is basically going to work. I showed you in phase 2, buy it, not because I can't do the phase 3, that's easy. We just did one 6 years ago. It's because you're going to make this drug for the next, hopefully 20 years, and then a generic will make it for the next 80. But you probably should decide how you want to make it. You want to make your raw material in Portugal and then move it over to Cork to your facility, and it's really inefficient to not do that. So if we get this working, that's my dream, because I think that's the most economically efficient, which means now I don't have to return so much to the investor, right? You guys lent me money, thank you so much. Here, it's easier to get back to you at a return. The further you go, obviously, the higher the stakes, the greater the risk, the more you're going to want back as the investor, right? You're going 15 years with my money. That's the optimum point, but really for all these incentives and whole mechanism, you shouldn't be asking any of us. You should be going to Merck and Novartis and Roche and saying, if I do this, will you buy their drug? For how much? And then I'll tell you, that's not enough to pay the investors back, or it is. That's the litmus test for all these incentives, is it going to make pharma want to buy iPhones and sell them? That's it.
And if anyone wants to pitch in from our online audience, just feel free to turn on your cameras and unmute your microphones and jump in.
A little naive, perhaps, question. I was thinking about what happens to the price when it goes generic. Who's making this money? And I suppose it's other companies that have already the production capability that just get only the revenue, I suppose, because they're not spending on the research of it. So in that side, and then of course, what happens to the price of the company? You have to adjust to the. So I suppose it falls, but how much does it fall, and how much does it impact on that? Yeah. But then the question that came to my mind after, and I think it connects with this, and that's perhaps very naive, but why are we connecting? It sounds like there's two things happening in the same company. Now you're doing research and you're spending a lot of money on that, and this is basic research and clinical, and then you're doing market economy, full-on commercializing, and so. And then why are we coupling these things together? What's the history of these things coming together? As you were saying, why can't one bit of it do all of the research and the clinical, and you sell this directly to the generic? What's the
I'll sell. They just got to pay enough that I can pay you back for lending me your money.
So the problem is the investor more than anything. Who's
everything?
Money
the pharma's behavior and my behavior are driven by the investors, who are everyone in this room, including me, right? Because I want 5% back on that mutual fund this year, and that's where it's we got to get the conversation away from. So if pharma's so say I get my drug to phase 2 and it looks amazing and it's almost done. That's my dream. That's the best spot. You take the manufacturing chain, repeat the phase 3. I already de-risked everything. All the tox is done. Whatever. We got a pediatric plan. I will sell right there. That's the optimum point to not go too far. What are you buying it for, pharma? $10 million, because I think this thing's worthless. Well, then I can't pay the investor back, so we're all logjam. So I'm going to go further on my own, right? That's really where, I mean, Qiagen didn't go public because it wanted to go public. We had to finance to finish because people weren't paying the price for the asset even then that it would have taken to pay back, right? And so, but what dictates what the pharma would pay, what they think they're going to make if they own it. And so if we solve back there, and they're like, oh, if I buy this, I'm going to make $1 billion. Okay, I'll pay you 150 million way back here because I have to do the rest of it, right? And it's that simple. We're all logjam because the end game, the products lose money. If they make money, pharma will want to sell them, and then they'll want to buy me for something where I can pay back the investor, which is all of us, right? And then I get to do it a second time, which is like my favorite thing. Like our pipeline got imploded. Like we had an asset, but we had a pipeline, and it just, right? And all the laboratory equipment and it's incredibly inefficient. I would love to just take all the risk out, sell it, and move again, but I can't sell it for where I can pay the investor back for what it costs to get there yet. We got to make the products more attractive in the market, and it will truly flow backwards. I hate trickle down, but it's a product problem, right? All the way back to the beginning. Why would I want to buy that for that much? Well, if you don't, I can't pay back the people because it costs that much to get here.
Yeah, research doesn't make that actually uses money doesn't make it.
I know. I was talking to someone recently, and they were fascinated about this idea that all we do is lose money for the entire history of the company until the end. And I'm like, that's how it all works.
What did you, I mean, in retrospect, what would you have done differently?
With like at Qiagen,
Yeah.
sold my stock because I was never an executive. No, I mean, I was a scientist, and we were so fixated on getting the problems with the FDA fixed and predicting like where the market was moving and the epidemiology.
So where did things go wrong? So one thing was the narrower indication, right?
The indication was urinary tract infection. There's 8 million cases a year in the US. The intention is only use it for carbapenem resistance. The label doesn't say that. The label says this drug is approved for the treatment of urinary tract infections, including acute pyelonephritis. There's tens of millions there are 10 million of those a year in the US. The intended, you shouldn't use this unless you're this resistant, is not our fault. We were solving the problem everyone said. Solve the resistant problem. You could definitely use plazomicin to treat a wild type UTI. Right now its market's big. But everyone said, no, that's bad. Only use it for this UTI. So our approval is broad.
But initially it was to develop a drug which was going to work on on carbapenem resistant organisms, right?
And that's still the use case, but the approval is for a broad indication with millions of patients.
But didn't Qiagen factor in that it would be used in as kind of a drug of last resort? Or
Yeah.
So their numbers should have told them, of 10 million UTIs, how many are drug resistant? Maybe 10%, I don't know.
And you are calling that shot 6 years in the past, but yes, I said it's like trying to throw a touchdown in the fourth quarter of a football game, but you got to throw the pass in the first quarter.
So it's just a very complicated, it's about getting multiple things right with multiple uncertainties in the future.
Yeah, and think about it. When we developed plasma, it wasn't about CRE, it was about gram-negative resistance. It was really about ESB health.
Mm-hmm.
But CRE came up, and it became a more important thing. I think there was one case in the United States. Then there were 30,000. That's pretty good. But like, if it was 300,000, it would have been better for us, worse for the world. So like, is the world telling us don't come till there's 300,000? Because they're clearly not accepting 30,000 was enough to bother to save them. But I think what caught us in the US is we could price high. That's why it's still launched. Just no one, they put it on formulary like it's expensive. And that's a whole different US-centric problem we have with reimbursement that's not related to Europe. In Europe, it's almost more helpful. They just said out of the gate, you're going to lose money. And then we're like, okay, pull it out. So they're two different problems, but the same ultimate thing. But maybe we were just dumb. I don't know. I know everyone else did the same thing. It's not like we were alone. But I think part of it was like, yeah, there's no reimbursement in the hospital. It's going to be tough. We got mortality data. People are going to use it. And then the data came and it didn't. They just didn't. It didn't overwhelm.
But there have been studies done subsequently that have shown that new drugs are only being used in 30% of the cases that they could be used in CRE, for example, in the US. Medicare people came out afterwards and said we contributed directly to the failure because we didn't price. The way we think about pricing didn't reflect the societal use of this drug. I've quoted that in the paper.
But importantly, Medicare doesn't have the authority. They identified the problem, but they need Congress to give them the authority. We had the piece of legislation to do that in 2014. It was Bill Cassidy in Louisiana. And I lobbied for that in Congress, and they said, how are we going to fix it? this antibiotic problem. I'm like, oh, it's really easy. We just need to charge really high prices. And they're like, oh, like that's, but it was not lying. I'm like, it's the math. I'm like, wait, or we got to wait till there's more people. And they're like, well, don't do that either. I'm like, well, that's not fair.
Yeah.
But I think we, you know, until we bankrupted the companies, no one believed us.
I mean, it does seem to be this fundamental problem that usefulness has nothing to do with the economic model. Like, the drug was useful, it had its uses, and that was like quite disconnected to the economic model that you were trying to shoehorn the drug into.
Well, I don't know if we were shoehorning it. It's into the economic model that were enforced on us, right? I mean, I always knew it was hard in the hospital. And this is actually not an antibiotic problem in the US. It's a hospital product problem. Yeah. Every hospital product has the same problem. So it's just that our only place for innovation where the most dire need is unfortunately tied in that environment, right? So we're kind of stuck. Look what happened with cancer. CAR T comes along, it's too complicated to get out of the hospital. So what do? We created an exception. This is what we've been asking for antibiotics in the United States for 10 years. Is like create an exception because we've got this dire unmet need and we need a high price. It's not going to cost the system that much because the whole reason the price is high is there's not that many people. And by the time there's lots of people, we're generic. That's a good trade. But getting people to accept high prices was just too difficult. I thought we could do it. And I remember, I'm running research. To be fair, there's probably smarter people that knew more.
What about the question of so many of the drugs coming out of the pipeline going to the US first and then failing in the US market and then therefore not, maybe not always therefore, but sometimes therefore, not being accessible anywhere afterwards because they seem to have failed there?
Well, I mean, most drugs, if you can't make them work in the US, nobody gets it. I mean,
Right,
you guys know
we
it.
know
You're
that
paying
the
way
need,
less, and we know.
well, we know that the need for these drugs is elsewhere.
Yeah.
So could it be in future that helps some kind of difference? The US doesn't come first because...
Well, where comes first and who's paying for all those costs?
Well, I mean, that's a very valid question, and I think many in the recent discussion that I've attended, there has been some thinking around what about making some move to developing some antibiotics in the so-called global south, by the global south, and for the global south where the prevalence and the disease burden is highest. It's just that should we be bold enough to try alternatives such as that? Because, as you say, if developing it in high-income countries and running after registration in the US market, only to have it fail afterward is just a compelling case that maybe the case for developing it in some developing countries is worth looking at it.
Yeah, and to be clear, in my mind, with the stuff, I can't get into it on WebEx, but like I'm thinking about this for how do we do it? I'm assuming we need the US though, because who's paying the 920 million back? My hope was if I can get that solved, I will literally just volume commit to me and you'll get it for basically nothing, like net zero. If the Global South can pay 920 million risk-adjusted back for the product, we're golden. That takes care of the purple box.
What you're talking about is tiered pricing that we see in high-value medicines. Yeah. It's clearly not working in antibiotics because the market's not working anywhere in novel antibiotics at the moment, but that concept of cross-subsidizing cost or cost plus or even loss-making in other markets by being able to charge enough in high-income contexts is something you do see in other drug classes, but not something that we've kind of thought about, well, not that I've seen written about in this space yet.
I'm still assuming like 10 years from now, if we actually do anything about this and fix it, because remember, it's been 10, there's 12. Revagenix was the first 12 years in the US, is that the US will pay back the innovation cost. That's the biggest cost. So it's 920 million times some multiplier for, I was going to like no interest bubble. And then the big question is, can you enter new markets without losing money? I'm committed to figuring this out with the LMICs, and GARP knows I'm interested in this idea. If there's a way to make the LMICs or the interveners there pay the innovation cost, I'm all for it. I just need to solve that purple box. But the interesting one is in between Europe. Europe does not understand that when I enter their market, I add a bunch of those new costs. Like I duplicate several of the costs for the US, and it's much more complicated to enter, and I think we're just gonna not do it. It saves me a lot of money to not bother. And I don't think there's like taking GDP and dividing it, or sorry, 3 billion, that's not accounting for segregated markets of individualistic costs that I have to pay for. And that, so that's not good math.
That's the Canada problem, right? It's too small for a separate.
Yeah, if they don't, well, Canada and Australia are more hopeful, and I've talked to both, if they're listening, I'd be talking more, because they're more aligned with FDA. The problem is like, if I say, okay, US paid all the innovation costs, right? Meaning I can make the money back there. All I need to do is not lose money entering a new market, and I cut that out of this because I was worried about time. I'm glad I did, because I went over. If I want to, like, let's enter one country in Europe right now, I have a different pediatric trial to do. It's $25 million. Are you going to pay me $25 million for this? No. You want me to label in Swiss and French and German and different rules about how the label goes on? All these little pockets of things that I wonder how we solve and we got to get ahead on. But the segregated market, Canada and Australia are much more like whatever the FDA said, we'll just go with. Actually, that might be true, but from my impression, a non-regulator, Europe's going to say, well, we need these 10 different things. And we're like, okay, well, that's a new list that we got to get back to zero on. So I think over time, this is just a prediction. If we do figure it out in the US, I think Europe will be cut off for a period where they realize we either have to pay more, which we want to do, and I agree, they shouldn't, or we're going to have to harmonize more with the United States so we don't make people do extra work for no reason, just because the laws are written slightly differently. Because I think if one or the other got left out, it's much more likely to be Europe. Just because I think there are some ways in the US system we could have navigated differently and at least eked out a living. You saw some products kind of made it, not exciting, but made it, like omadacycline, right?
Yeah, but they had the post-approval award, which made a big difference, presumably, to this some of the issues that we've outlined that Caregen faced.
Looks exactly like that workshop we put on. That's cute. Fun.
I mean, that came in, and paid manufacturing costs, gave a volume.
It looked exactly like the workshop, is all I'll say publicly. But yes, I know. But do we want the US government to do that for every product?
Right.
Or was that a moment to save a couple organizations that, we wanted to keep around because we're losing all the scientists and developers, right? I think probably the latter, but yeah, the US came to the rescue to save a couple products again. So.
And then there's the whole biosecurity question. So we hosted a meeting the other week here about whether conflict's going to be, after the high-level meeting, is conflict going to be a game changer? And the heartening thing, and Damien was on the panel as well, the heartening thing to hear from WHO, from the quadripartite, was the negotiations going into the political declaration were much less politically charged in the difficult geopolitical world we're in today than you see in other spaces. So that was very good to hear.
Yeah.
But, listening to the colleagues earlier today talking about different... you just talked about the problems with what's come out of the pipeline and how similar it is, and we heard a colleague earlier, I'm not sure if you were here yet, but we heard a colleague earlier talking specifically about some of the isolates they've been working with coming out of conflict and exactly that problem, and talking about some of the relatively newer drugs that are coming out of the pipeline that are already seeing enormous amounts of resistance in these conflict environments, and wondering whether, this can... Caregen was started with biosecurity money. There was a Project BioShield on this post-approval. There is still this huge US biosecurity investment thinking around this space. Potentially, it's an even bigger problem today than it was when everyone got scared because of the anthrax threat at the beginning of all of this story. That's why we put the same things on the agenda, these topics on the agenda for today.
When the biodefense money came in the middle, we were a regular venture-backed company. Antibiotics were never sexy, but you de-risked at phase 1. That's kind of cool for a VC. That's like, whoa, that's a good investment. I think over time, the belief of the value of the thing when it was approved started to slowly decay and then massively accelerate, right? The biodefense money was a convenient thing that wasn't required. We were raising money from regular venture capitalists like any other company. Our one advantage was, look, we're not as sexy as cancer, but we don't fail in phase 3 nearly as much. We fail in phase 1, right? And so that's actually counterbalances. We didn't realize once the thing was approved, it was negative value, right? And nobody did, right? I mean, maybe someone did. They should have told me. But we had to work through this as a community. I mean, I really thought, of course I didn't want it to happen. It was my baby. It hurt me personally very much, like very personally. But I was like, at least the bankruptcies will get change to happen. And we're 5 years in, and I'm like, TikTok, like, seriously? And the pandemic 3 months after that workshop, seriously? And I knew what was going to happen. We're going to spend a fortune on this thing, and everyone's going to have a hangover and not want to deal with the other thing. And we're still there now, and maybe we need to wait 5 more years to have real conversations. Because the numbers thrown around, like if I spend $50 million now, 7 years from now, I might get 10 million pounds for 3 years. No. And that's the add-on cost, not the innovation cost, like the new market entry add-on cost, right?
So who's investing now in the pipeline?
You have better access than I. If you're asking about me personally, I'm gonna withhold that information, but I don't know. I mean, maybe some crazy people. There are people that think you can innovate your way out of it, but most of the things I showed there, the technology doesn't change any of it. Right? There's nothing about, like, it's not like, oh, if you develop a phage, you don't have to follow the law and do a pediatric trial and make GMP, If they can sell massive volume for some reason ethically, then they do win and they do solve the equation, right? But it doesn't. We did have a period that was kind of painful where people were throwing new innovation, and I'm like, what does that change about the fundamental dynamics here? There's not enough people for how fast we cure them to get to zero unless we wait till there's more people, but everyone's saying don't do that. And that felt really unfair in that period of time.
Okay, I think we should be wrapping up around now. Thank you so much. This was a fantastic conversation. Sharing everything. I don't know if anyone has any final remarks on this before we move on. If not, I suggest we take a couple of minutes break before moving on to the final remarks.
Well, I think we should, my remarks are short. I think there's a lot to digest, so I'm not sure I can be very coherent. But I just wanted to take a moment to sort of summarize what we've seen today. This morning we had one panel which addressed or gave examples of the kind of global infrastructures that enable the development of antibiotics, phage therapy. Anyway, we had this notion that the supply chains and the infrastructure to enable access to samples, all the things that you need to develop antibiotics have been sort of cobbled together over a long period of time, 100 years or so. So there's a very long history to this, and there's kind of these infrastructures that that stay, like their material, their factories, their networks of collaboration, their regulations, and these get repurposed over time. So there's a kind of, so I love this word, I don't know if anybody's familiar with it, but hysteresis. So you know it. So hysteresis is when a system keeps changing even after the input to drive the change is gone. So there's a kind of a lag. We saw some lag just now. There's a kind of a lag that's built into the system, right? There's these archives. So I thought that was very interesting because we're very wrapped up in the present, and we think of the problems that are the forces that are shaping our current problems as located in space, or as being, but they've actually been there for a while. And similarly, antibiotic resistance has been there for a while, and it's being selected out by human practices. So I thought that was very interesting, and the take-home message is it's all very complicated, but it really struck me that there's this kind of historical dimension. I mentioned earlier this kind of socialist moment, phage therapy in the USSR, the beginnings of the Chinese pharmaceutical industry, which is still kind of haunting the machine, right, in some of these discussions about innovation. We then shifted to a much more, I should say, biological discussion, but I think there what was very interesting, we were talking about conflict, AMR, was, the takeaway point for me is we know about AMR driving conflict, or conflict driving the pathways through which that conflict is an important pathway for driving antimicrobial resistance in humans, that there are different mechanisms in there that are all interesting and revelatory biologically, but not that interesting, don't change things in terms of international law. That was a discussion that we had with Dina sort of off stage or backstage. But I found it particularly, I think what I found particularly fascinating was Louis Patrick's talking about genetic, oh God, it's the first time I heard of this. So it's not about genetic analogy, it's about structural analogy. We now have the AI tools to look for genetic antimicrobial resistance, and it's much more prevalent than we think. So that just leads to more hand-wringing. But I think what was really, I think what wasn't raised was this, the way in which, or how we have this much more ecological kind of understanding about how genes move through environment and across organisms. So we have this kind of, how would I call it, organismal reduction. Like our unit of analysis is the organism, the bacteria, the virus, the human. And I think we've moved into this post-organismal moment where we're talking about microbiomes, and we're talking about sort of communities of bacteria, and for which humans are just the accidental scaffolding. And what we're seeing also is this sort of constant genetic circulation or bacterial communication. I don't know, I don't have quite the right metaphors. So this is kind of, seems to me to be leads to a very different kind of paradigm for thinking about this sort of tip of the iceberg, which is antimicrobial resistance in humans. And I think what we've heard just now is about the challenges of, and super interesting, I hadn't actually realized, when you asked me the question, give me another example, antibiotics do cure the other niche diseases you don't cure. I can't think, hepatitis C, so it is a fascinating, unique problem, which is we can cure this. And the way in which money is made and innovation is rewarded in the pharmaceutical space relies on what I actually said at the beginning, in a way, on chronic diseases where you can grow your market by changing your indication or inventing a new indication, like in psychiatry, like in statins, So that you can't. This is the only case where growing the market is bad, has bad public health implications. In the sense of waiting for the market to grow. So I accept that this is actually a unique situation, and it's interesting because it's the result of medical progress. So what I'm starting to wonder is, are we going to see this in oncology, for example? Are we going to, because in oncology and in transplant medicine, this is a growing problem, right? People get on immunosuppressants post-transplants develop cancers. People develop cancers because they've been treated with chemotherapy for earlier cancers like non-Hodgkin's lymphomas and so on. So I'm sort of wondering whether the antibiotic resistance, I'm talking really about antibiotic resistance, is the kind of, to use Nadya's term, the canary in the mine for other kind of iatrogenic public health problems. So those are my attempts to make sense of all of this. I have a few public service announcements to make. So first of all, once again, please register if you, so first of all, if this conference is being recorded, and if you do not want, and will be made public, will be put on our YouTube channel and website. If you do not wish to be on this recording, please let us know after the conference or send your request to globalhealth, one word, @graduateinstitute.ch. You can scan the QR code on the screen or the link dropped in the chat box. I think it will be dropped. If you would like to register to be part of our community of practice, this is not spamming you. This is really to share information, well, give you the links to, for example, the web recording and so on, and other stuff coming out of this conference. So thank you all for participating, those who were here and those who came from, who attended online. Once again, conference will be recorded, will be on the website and the YouTube channel. I wanted to particularly thank Nadya and Anthony for all the work you've done with FINPHARM over the years, in a long time. Many other people have been involved with FINPHARM over the years. Ryan Whitaker, notably, and our students, Dina, of course. I was getting to Dina. We've had all our students, we've had our master's students, we have the courses, and we've had our PhD students, of which Dina is the only PhD student, right? Only PhD student.
Nadya is one of your PhD students too.
Sorry?
No, not on the project.
On the project. And also from the Global Health Center for putting together the comms and the webinar, Bettina Zago and Katerina Ferreira. So thank you to everyone, and with 3 minutes to go, we'll stop there.
Thank you so much, everybody.